to welcome you all in organizing something like this, which is the first time we've had an in-person event for the Retired Faculty Association in years. This indeed is the 18th lecture that we've organized for the distinguished professors on the campus. Not only do we feel very proud of our distinguished professors, but we felt that they are amply vetted to be able to give us sterling and wonderful, outstanding talks, which has been the case so far, and I'm sure that's going to be the case. I'm doing my best to embarrass our speaker today. But anyhow, the first person I'd like to introduce is Dave Kasoy, who is the president of the Retired Faculty Association, as well as being the academic fossil of the university.
Well, I want to make this very brief. I want to thank Kim Malville and Bob Grossman, who's online here on Zoom, for organizing all of this. It was their bright idea to marshal all of these distinguished professors and have them speak. And we've had a wonderful array of speakers, mostly all online. So this is a wonderful showing, and I really appreciate everybody's attendance here today. That's enough said. I'm going to introduce our speaker.
No, me. You're going to introduce me.
We're going to introduce Kim Malvo will introduce the speaker.
So it is really an honor to introduce someone like Marjorie. I have her CV, and I will not go through it page by page. Whoops.
An alert that's come on our cell phones. Somebody's gotten in trouble somewhere, and it'll stop soon.
So I was pleased to see that Marjorie graduated. We'll start at the very beginning from Ann Arbor High School, and Michigan was my first academic job. So I was very pleased to see that. She has a master's, interestingly, has a master's degree in African history, as well as a PhD in modern English history. The African history is significant, considering that both she and Dick spent a year, I guess, in Makerere College in Kampala, Uganda. She was, I think the most interesting thing to me was that she was a commencement speaker at the University of Colorado commencement in 2004. There must have been a crowd of thousands listening to you. She became a distinguished, she was a distinguished professor, made a distinguished professor in 2000. She received the Robert Stearns Award for Extraordinary Achievement, selected as the Teacher of the Year, 1981 and 1983. One of the things that I find most interesting is she's the founder of the Norland Scholars Program, and she was a visiting professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies at Makerere College in Kampala. So her talk today, as you can see, is a demonstration of the eclectic and extremely varied topics and approaches of history today. So Marjorie.
It is a great honor for me to be part of this distinguished lecture series. I'm very grateful to the CU Boulder Retired Faculty Association and to Kim for making it possible. My talk is going to be more mundane than David Korovar's beautiful performance last month, but I hope it may be of some interest. For the past decade, I have been doing historical research and writing as part of the Boulder County Latino History Project. This initiative, started in 2013, was directed and implemented by members of the Latino community themselves. Led by an advisory committee, 100 interns and volunteers gathered thousands of sources, one of the best collections for any Latinx group in this country. The project made all those sources available on a website and trained hundreds of teachers on how to integrate material about Latinos into their classrooms. I was a member of the Latino History Project as an ally and helper, and I loved being part of it. You will hear more about that project at the end of today's talk. During the previous decade, I had been doing research in very different parts of the world. While based at universities in East and West Africa, I gathered information with local partners about women and their work in the 19th and 20th centuries. The African projects were rewarding in part because they addressed issues of active public concern in those countries at the very time we were doing the research. Working in Africa stretched my cultural awareness and let me collaborate with admirable people. Although Latino and African research over the past 20 years was in a sense the culmination of my career, it constituted a huge leap from the kind of work I had done before. While in graduate school, and for many years after that, I studied the history of late medieval and early modern England. For that research, which resulted in a number of books and articles, I developed some highly specialized research skills. How to unfold a strip of sheepskin parchment that had been rolled up tight for 700 years without ripping it. How to decipher abbreviated medieval Latin written in terrible handwriting. But while doing that research, I was also gaining transferable historical skills. How to define a project, look for appropriate sources to study it, evaluate and analyze evidence, and write it up in a comprehensive manner. Those were qualities I was able to draw upon later, when curiosity about other cultures and periods led me to venture into entirely different areas. In this talk, I will explain why engaging with history has been so intellectually stimulating and personally rewarding, why I have so greatly enjoyed doing research and writing for over 55 years. Regardless of the setting, it has been exciting to identify gaps in our historical knowledge and to draw attention to people who have previously not been studied. I relished the historical detective work of seeking out little-used sources with which to investigate these topics. Whenever possible, I went to the places I was studying and interacted with people there. Because I defined new topics and made use of new approaches, my work has sometimes seemed novel to others. Several of my books were described as trailblazing or as helping to create a new field. This talk will trace my atypical progression between places and periods. I hope to answer the questions you may well be asking yourselves right now. Why in the world did she move around between these apparently unrelated fields? Is she merely an intellectual dilettante, flitting superficially between subjects? To situate my own studies within a broader academic context, I will relate them to some of the major changes that transformed the discipline of history as a whole across the 20th and early 21st century, particularly those that address communities' work. While, of course, the past itself has not altered, the practice of history has. Historians have debated for what purposes research should be conducted and how it should be done, by what methodologies and by whom. The key elements in this gradual redefinition of the field may be summarized as follows. And here I'm speaking particularly about community studies. First, the range of topics considered worthy of historical inquiry has expanded, and the reasons for valuing historical knowledge and understanding have broadened, leading the discipline to become more diverse, inclusive, and in some cases directed explicitly at current concerns. Secondly, emerging computer-based technologies have made possible analysis of a wider range of sources and facilitated dissemination. Quantification supports large-scale and comparative studies and enables sophisticated geographical analysis. while communication technology makes information available to a wider audience. The field has redefined who are the legitimate preservers of historical knowledge and who should transmit that information, with academic historians increasingly working in partnership with people from other disciplines and community members becoming empowered to record and present their own histories. I'll go back now to the start of my career and the world of historical studies that surrounded it. When I was an undergraduate history major at Harvard, starting in 1958, and a PhD student there until 1967, my professors were generally very conservative. They were still thinking in terms of what has been defined within the British context as a Whig approach to history, a carryover from the 19th century. For Whig scholars, the goal of history was to explain the development of the great institutions and ideas that characterize the apex of Western civilization. To do so, they focused on the political, intellectual, and religious roles of elite males. My professors had not been influenced by, and indeed showed no signs of having ever heard of, the radical new approach then exciting many younger historians, including me. That approach directed attention at the lives and beliefs of ordinary people and at the economic and social features of communities. Part of the motivation for such inquiries was to understand what contributed to the terrible events in Europe during the 1930s and 40s, in hopes of avoiding similar horrors in the future. In my case, it was only after considerable persuasion that my PhD committee grudgingly allowed me to do a study of an English family in the 15th and 16th centuries, highlighting its women members and its role in the community where they lived. My committee warned me that my topic was of marginal historical value and would certainly not help me get a job. When I began my first post-PhD project in the 1970s, I knew that some historians were starting to use methodologies borrowed from other social science disciplines, especially quantification. I realized that England's abundant records between 1200 and 1600 made possible quantified analyses of economic and demographic patterns within individual communities. Local court records likewise permitted examination of how non-elites governed themselves. I therefore started research on the large and exceptionally well-documented royal manor of Havering near London, where the family I had studied in my dissertation was based. While using its records, scattered among multiple archives, I spent time in Havering, walking around the area and talking with local historians. I bet you didn't realize that you are looking right now at an honorary vice president of the Havering and District Historical Society. Havering's rich sources permitted several kinds of novel analyses. In economic terms, for example, I was able to quantify several detailed surveys of landholding in medieval Havering, tracing the number of acres held not only by the larger tenants, but also by the poor. To do this, I had to enter information about their holdings by hand onto a 4x6 card for each of the hundreds of people and manually calculate the net acreages. Ugh. Demographic work, which I likewise carried out manually, included analyses of birth, marriages, and deaths, and calculation of average family sizes. The records of Havering's local court permitted study of how the community regulated forms of social misbehavior that disturbed public peace and good order, such as eavesdropping, rowdy alehouses, and wrongdoing associated with poverty. Research on Havering which took many years, resulted in 2 books, divided chronologically at 1500. When they were published, their focus on aspects of community experience that had not previously been examined, and their quantitative approach led some reviewers to describe them as models of innovative community studies. That would not have been the reaction a generation or 2 earlier. A series of technological developments between the later 1960s and the 1990s revolutionized the field of history, as they did many other academic fields. The initial element was the introduction of computers and the software to accompany them. First, mainframe computers operated by large institutions, and then smaller personal versions. For historians, computer technology facilitated quantitative studies and made possible new kinds of research on communities. Shortly thereafter came mapping technology, fairly simple at first, but leading to widespread use of sophisticated geographic information systems by the early 21st century. I was fortunate to be able to take early advantage of these new tools. During much of the decade after 1976, I was in Cambridge, England. It was a hotbed of technologically based experimentation with an enthusiastic team of historians and other social scientists using the university's first mainframe computer to conduct demographic and economic analyses. The Cambridge group kindly allowed me to take part in their discussions and activities and provided advice on how to employ the new tools in my own work. Personal computers and user-friendly statistical software soon became available, followed by mapping technology. My next study on how English communities attempted to control social wrongdoing, 1370 to 1600, relied on a personal computer, spreadsheets, and mapping possibilities. The Havering project had demonstrated that local records could provide information about efforts to limit various types of misbehavior. Although such records survived for hundreds of communities throughout England, they had received almost no historical attention. They were written in highly abbreviated medieval Latin by partially educated local clerks whose penmanship was often dreadful. And information about social wrongdoing was generally buried among other local concerns. I realized that perhaps these documents could be used to identify broader patterns over place and time. Starting in 1990, I spent 1 full year and 4 summers traveling around by car to 83 local archives, going to every county and many cities in England. From those 83 archives, I gathered information about 255 communities throughout the country between 1370 and 1600. As far as I know, no other historian has worked in that many English archives. In each locale, I stayed in a farmhouse bed and breakfast place where I could chat with the farmer and his wife about local conditions today. After the archive closed for the day, I drove around to see the places whose records I had just used. For the Misbehavior Project, I took notes while in the archives on an early laptop, described as portable, but so big and heavy I could hardly lift it. Later, I coded the information and with much appreciated help from several history graduate students, entered it into data files using quantitative software. With 1 click of my finger, my computer now instantly produced tables and graphs like this one, which would have required weeks, if not months, to generate by hand. As computer mapping started to become available, I realized its potential for the project I was working on. I was fortunate to collaborate with an early mapping programmer here in Boulder, interested in experimenting with my historical materials. First, we had to create a digital map of England. None existed at that time apart from the military. Not much help for me. I then entered the geographic coordinates for my 255 places into the data files. They could be linked with mapping software to produce stunning visual displays. I could, for instance, ask my computer to select the communities concerned with misbehavior in a given decade and show those places on the map using a different color and shape to represent each type of wrongdoing. Instantly, I would see an elegant color map on my screen with the relevant information jumping out from it. That was so exciting. You may wonder why I am not showing you one of those color printouts, but the original maps are now inaccessible. That highlights a problem with many forms of digital data produced by the new technologies: how to preserve information longer term. That question is a major concern for individual scholars and for libraries and other archives. The book that resulted from the Misbehavior Project received considerable attention from people in multiple fields. Another change in the discipline of history was occurring by the 1990s. A growing number of scholars were expanding the global horizons of our field, exploring the history of non-Western areas of the world. This led to a burgeoning of excellent studies, many of which challenged colonial assumptions and attempted explicitly to understand how the past continues to shape contemporary post-independence patterns. Just look at this splendid array of books about South and East Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the Caribbean, published by my colleagues in CU's history department since the year 2000. I too became part of this widening of scope and purpose. Around 2000, I began wondering whether I could transfer aspects of the research techniques I had already gained into unfamiliar parts of the world and modern time periods. The prospect of doing research on entirely new topics and living in new countries as I moved into my 60s was exhilarating, if a little daunting. I had just finished a study of women and their involvement in the English market economy, 1300 to 1620. So I thought perhaps I could carry out a parallel examination of women's work in Uganda and among the Yoruba ethnic group of southwestern Nigeria during the 19th and 20th centuries. My MA, as Kim said, had been in African history, but I was aware I would have to make scrupulously clear that I was not a formally trained scholar in African studies. Moreover, to work sensitively in such different environments, I would need to form research partnerships and get help from local assistants. These rather adventurous potential topics offered many attractions. I was intrigued by the opportunity to extend my long interest in community studies into very different settings, and to tackle a topic of immediate contemporary relevance. At that time, both Uganda and Nigeria were engaged in heated debates about the proper roles of women in the public economies of their communities, whether local or national. Altered work patterns for women had profound implications for gender definitions, family relations, and political participation. Another attraction of this project was that it would involve interviews using the methodologies developed by anthropologists. Although I would not know the local languages myself, I loved the idea that with help from my research partners, I could talk with the people who were being studied, asking questions about issues central to our inquiry. For a medieval historian, talking to people was a thrilling prospect. So I started in on the two African projects. They involved fairly challenging research, but let me work with admirable local partners and helpers. Each resulted in a book, and to my relief, given my uncertainty about whether my work would be accepted by real Africanists, the studies were favorably reviewed by specialists. Let me tell you a little about the research. In Uganda, I spent a year and several summers at Makerere University in Kampala, teaching in the Department of Women and Gender Studies, the first of its kind in sub-Saharan Africa. Although I knew I wanted to do research about women and their work during the colonial and independence periods, coming right up to the present, I did not feel competent to attempt it by myself. So I was grateful that Professor Grace Bantebia Chomuhendo, a British-trained anthropologist and the head of my department, was eager to join me. Grace was a delight to work with, and I learned a huge amount from her as we defined and carried out the project, and then spent several years writing it up together. These slides may give you an impression of Makerere and Grace. I was also able to travel to many parts of Uganda with the 5 excellent graduate students in women and gender studies who used their local languages to do the interviews on which much of the project was based. While in Uganda, I had a chance to learn a little about local communities in person, thanks to multiple stays in a remote village where I was the guest of the family of a lower-level staff member at Makerere. Getting to the village was strenuous, requiring 6 hours on a bus, the passenger seat of a motor scooter, and the back of a pickup truck, but the trip was well worth it. Because I was the first white person ever to stay in that village, I was taken around to various community and religious activities and visited the homes of many other families. Before we leave Uganda, I can't resist showing you this slide. Are we looking here at a potential sister organization for CU Boulder's Retired Faculty Association? After finishing the Ugandan project, I wanted to learn more about the situation for women in southwestern Nigeria. Yoruba women were famous for their economic independence and their leadership roles, their leadership roles within their local communities throughout the colonial and later years. So they offered an interesting contrast to the more limited roles of Ugandan women. For the Nigerian research, I was based at the University of Ibadan, but spent time at 4 other universities and used the extensive archives preserved in Nigeria, as well as those in London. Nigeria at that time had a bad reputation, as foreigners were sometimes being abducted for ransom. Before leaving Boulder, I therefore established contact with a number of Nigerian academics by email, and then stayed only in university guest houses and was careful about where and how I exchanged money. I'm happy to report that I never needed to use the pepper spray that I carried in my purse just in case. A third African opportunity came while I was a visiting professor at the main Islamic University in East Africa, located on the Kenyan-Ugandan border. I was asked to organize a project with 2 goals: documenting the lives of Muslims living in small, isolated villages high on the slopes of volcanic Mount Elgon, and demonstrating that in these little communities, Muslims, Christians, and animists were coexisting peacefully. With financial assistance from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the US Embassy, I like that pairing, we obtained tape recorders and simple cameras and trained students in the social sciences who knew the local languages and would be welcomed into those villages to do the research. The results were fascinating. We return now to the Boulder County Latino History Project, an outstanding example of community-based historical work. A decade ago, after finishing African projects, I became curious about the history of Boulder County, particularly the role of Latinos. But when I went to the library to read up on the subject, I found that almost nothing had been written about Latinx history in this region. Conversation with a number of respected Latino leaders in Longmont, Lafayette, and Boulder made clear that they all deplored the invisibility of their people, fearing that their history, their footprint, would disappear without a trace. So they decided in 2013 to form the Boulder County Latino History Project, led by an advisory committee that defined and guided the project. This devoted group met monthly for 3 years over potluck dinners to define goals, procedures, and personnel. I had the honor of being included in the project as an ally, helping to coordinate the work and get funds for it. Over the next 15 years, the next few years, 15 Latinx high school and college interns and more than 80 community volunteers gathered information of many kinds. Some did videographed interviews using equipment provided by CU's outreach program. Other researchers extracted quantitative information from school records and national censuses, entering it into spreadsheets. Families from throughout Boulder County brought in hundreds of photos and documents from the 19th and 20th centuries. Volunteers also combed through local newspapers, taking photos of relevant articles with their cell phones. The papers included standard ones, like the Boulder Daily Camera on the left, and more surprising ones, like the Rocky Mountain American on the right. Did you know that the main paper of the Ku Klux Klan for the Southwestern US was published in Boulder in the mid-1920s? I certainly didn't. The cartoon with a Klansman in his characteristic pointy hat holding the gate shut to immigrants bears a painful resemblance to attitudes today. This powerful image shows a rally of Boulder's own chapter of the Klan, complete with a trademark American flag and burning cross. After 3 years of work, the Latino History Project had assembled and digitized around 2,000 primary sources, one of the finest collections for any Latinx community in this country. Sharing all this material and getting it into use was a major goal of the advisory committee. To make the resources available to the full community, we created an open access website hosted by the CU libraries and posted everything on it. Over the following years, we ran training sessions for K through 12 teachers from across Colorado on how to use material about local Latinos in their classrooms. These trainings made use of a linked pair of websites that contained detailed lesson plans and other resources. I wrote a pair of books on behalf of the project describing what it had learned. The Boulder County Latino Project illustrates how far the discipline of history has moved over the past century with respect to community studies. We can view the impact of gradual change away from a Whig emphasis on institutions and ideas at the top of society by looking again at the 3 areas noted at the start of this talk. The topic of community-based research is often a group of people previously ignored in conventional histories. The purpose of such studies is to preserve their experiences and bring them into public awareness. Their history is not merely a matter of academic interest, as was generally true in the previous kinds of research we have described. In these projects, recording the contributions and struggles of a community preserves its own heritage. The work helps to validate the group's identity and provide strength for the future. The most important technological changes in this kind of research stem from improvements in communication and dissemination tools that make research and information available to non-specialists. Simple technologies like handheld cameras, cell phones, and basic interviewing equipment allow community members to do research themselves. Thanks to open access websites, information can be stored and shared with everyone who has a cell phone or laptop. The participants in community-based research and writing are generally members of the group under study. They define the goals and work together to assemble and share information. If academic historians are involved, they are usually there as advisors without special status because of their training or experience or occupation. Ownership of the Latino History Project and the visible results seen in the websites and books meant a great deal to local community members. In 2016, the advisory committee hosted a launch for the books, a gala affair at the Longmont Museum. The 3 county commissioners came to the event and read a proclamation honoring local Latinos. That evening was profoundly significant for many of the hundreds of Latinx attenders. One person commented, "I never thought I would see our community recognized like this, with all these officials saying how important our history is and what valued members of Boulder County we are today." At the book signing table, people said things like, "Look, that picture is my uncle in his Vietnam uniform. Imagine that, my family in a book." It still gives me shivers to think about the occasion. I hope my presentation has given you an introductory picture of some of the stages and factors that have reshaped the field of history since the early 20th century. I hope, too, it has made clear how much I have enjoyed working on the projects described here as illustrations of these broader changes. Studying diverse periods and places over the course of a long career is an intellectual luxury that few historians enjoy. And I'm grateful for the many research grants that supported my work. I want also to acknowledge the ongoing encouragement and many contributions of my husband, Dick McIntosh, who will be next month's speaker in this series. Thanks to his flexibility, we were able to go together on year-long stays away from Boulder, in some cases joined by our children. During 2 years in Cambridge and 2 in Oxford, Dick worked in cutting-edge research labs. In Uganda, he studied the parasite that causes sleeping sickness, carried by the tsetse fly. I hope it is indeed true, as he claims, that working in other labs helped him develop new research areas and new skills of his own. In conclusion, I'd like to return once more to the Boulder County Latino History Project, which has been particularly rewarding for me in personal terms. It was heartwarming to do research and writing with wonderful people who accepted me as a colleague and friend. And for a historian, there can be no greater reward than to have played a part in uncovering and preserving the past through a project that facilitates empowerment in the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. What an adventurous career in history you have demonstrated. It's just too bad we don't have more prospective undergraduate majors in history who could anticipate such a career as yours. Are there any questions for Marjorie? Dave?
What I notice is your emphasis on the difference in the perspectives of history by the local people, the folk, relative to the elite interpretation. Have you actually quantified that in some way in some of these particular environments?
The question was whether that I had pointed out that there were differences between examination of the elites and examination of ordinary people. And your question is whether I had quantified the differences in their outlooks. No, I didn't, because I never actually really studied elites myself at all. So lots and lots of other historians have, and there's some wonderful work on the kind of work that I described as Whig history, but it has been modernized and carried through in very important ways, looking again at the top of society. So I don't mean to dismiss or downplay the importance of those studies. They continue to be important, but that's not what I did. So I didn't really do that comparison. I'm sorry. Yeah.
You talked about the advantages of the technological advances and how it helped your work and you're thinking about these projects. Are there disadvantages?
Well, as somebody trained in an earlier period, that is the pre-technology, pre-computer period, I think there are certain disadvantages. But I think they're outweighed by the pluses. So for example, in the area of 16th and 17th century English history, when I was young and doing research, the way you learned about the history of ideas, the way you learned about farming patterns, the way you learned about how you conducted scientific research was you looked at books. And in the very beginnings, that meant you had to go to England or to research libraries here and look at the originals. In the next stage, there were microfilm copies of books, but they were kind of awful. They were very hard to use. And you had to crank through image by image. What has transformed many kinds of research in intellectual history or cultural history is the existence of online versions of all books published in England prior to 1714. They are not only gorgeously clear images of every page, but they are searchable. And they're searchable like not just only by the topics the historians have put in, but they're individually word searchable. So that means now that any sensible graduate student is going to choose a topic that involves working with these fabulously convenient resources that you can use at home on your own computer. That means that people are getting PhDs who've never been to England. And to me, that seems like kind of a loss. But in fact, I think I'm just being narrow-minded and like an old curmudgeon dinosaur, because if you're interested in those ideas, they've had access to them. They have not learned how to read manuscripts. So everything that I did, almost all of it, these local records were all manuscript handwritten. So students who are working with these much more convenient resources don't need to read handwritings. Great, it's a wonderful time saving for them. It makes life so much easier. It is 90% a plus, 95% a plus, but there's just a little piece of me that says, but. They've never even held a manuscript in their hand. So I think the biggest problem, I would say, with new technologies is the one I mentioned, though, and that is, what do you do about storage? How can you keep technological materials preserved in such a fashion that they will still be around in 50 years or 100 years? And that, as you may know, the field of what used to be called library science, it's now called information science, information studies. The largest single area of emphasis now for people in those fields is archiving material, storing material, how to get access to it. You can preserve a dead record simply by archiving it, but then can you search it? What will be available? What about the computers in 50 years? Are people going to have computers, or will there be entirely different sources? So those are all really serious questions that affect not just history, but everybody who's using these new digital materials. Yeah.
Marjorie, what were the misbehaviors that you studied and that people considered misbehaviors then? And if you look at current studies of social problems, whatever, how do they vary?
Oh, that's fun. Sorry, I'll try to be brief. You might otherwise get another.
Could you
summary
repeat the
of my
question
book.
for?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the question was, what kind of forms of misbehavior were seen as troublesome at the time I was working on it? And if you look at contemporary communities, are they still there, or are there other problems? Is that correct? Yeah. So I looked at the forms of wrongdoing under 3 headings, and I should say these are not criminal, legally defined misdemeanors or felonies. These were forms of behavior that the local community thought was disruptive and they wanted to do something about themselves. So the first category were problems that affected harmony within the community, good relations between people. So that was eavesdropping. I mean, literally standing outside the door of somebody's house. These were not very solid houses, and listening to what was happening and then distributing that. So it was spreading gossip. Another problem in that category was scolding, was people who just went around bad-mouthing everybody else, and they told malicious gossip, and they just made trouble within the community. So those were the kinds of community issues the harmony related with. The second category were ones that disrupted good order and proper behavior. So that consisted of sexual misbehavior, ale houses that were not properly kept under supervision, and then this wonderful category of loosely defined things like somebody is badly governed in his body. So one isn't quite sure what some of those meant. And then the third category were problems that came from poverty, such as taking wood out of hedges to be used for fuel. So the hedges were important because they kept the sheep in this field rather than going into that field. So hedges were essential. Hedge breaking was a problem. Another problem was if you had your normal village of community living around you, and then somebody started taking in a lot of sub-tenants, sub-residents, and you weren't really sure who they were, and all of a sudden your community was getting filled up with riffraff. That sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Who's moving into our neighborhood now? So that was another kind of a problem associated with poverty. So some of those problems are gone. That is, we are less concerned about eavesdropping. Our houses are a little more solidly constructed. We are still, however, concerned about local harmony and good relationships within communities. But in general, we don't use local government bodies, local courts to address it. I think in smaller villages in many parts of the world, there is still a lot of concern about it. And the other members of the community are likely, senior members would step in and encourage people not to try and be more amicable with each other. In terms of the categories of disorder, I think we're still concerned about those sorts of things. That is, we still are troubled about sexual behavior, about pubs and saloons and whatever that get too rowdy. Those trouble us now. And then, of course, we are very concerned about the problems associated with poverty, which for us takes primarily, in many cases, most visibly, a concern about homelessness. So I think that those three categories of concern still are very much with us and with most communities. But the ways in which they're dealt with and the specifics of how they're defined vary, I think. Does that more or less answer your question?
And we don't want any hedge breakers either.
Yeah, I know. That's a real problem in Boulder.